We are continuing our study here on the listener's commentary of the Gospel of Matthew. And in this recording, we're going to be looking at Matthew 26, 1 through 16. Before we jump into that, just a quick announcement. If you haven't heard already, there is now an app for the listener's commentary that makes navigation so much easier because you can listen by book, you can download to listen offline, and a number of things like that. So whether you're listening on an Apple device or an Android device, just go to Google Play or the App Store and you can download the app to your phone and you can have the listener's commentary with you in a much easier, much more useful sort of fashion. So check that out if that sounds helpful to you. All right, on this recording, we're going to be looking at Matthew 26, 1 through 16. And in context, Jesus has just finished a large teaching block. It's the final teaching block in the Gospel of Matthew. And beginning here then at 26 verse 1, Matthew is going to focus on narrating the final events leading up to Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And so Matthew 26 verse 1 picks up like this. When Jesus had finished all these words, and Matthew has used this kind of phrase all throughout his gospel as the way to mark the end of a teaching block, which we just did in chapter 25. So when Jesus had finished all this teaching, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man is to be handed over for crucifixion." Jesus has been warning them of this. They've been having a hard time getting it. They're not accepting it. They're struggling with this idea of him dying and being resurrected, but he's been warning them and teaching them and expecting them to get it. And so now he just says, that's what's going to happen. That's what's going to happen, that the Son of Man, he himself, is going to be handed over for crucifixion. And notice that it's tied closely with the story of Passover. You know, after 2 days, the Passover is coming. And so both Jesus and Matthew, in recounting this for us, connects Jesus' death very closely with Passover. And this was an important connection for the early Christians. In fact, the Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 a little statement that says this, "Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough? Clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as in fact you are unleavened." And the whole idea of Passover was cleaning out leaven. You would get rid of leaven, and then Passover would culminate with a Passover feast, but then lead to a 7-day feast of unleavened bread. And so Paul is calling all this to mind with this little statement. And then he says this, "For Christ, our Passover, has also been sacrificed." That is 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7. "Therefore, let's celebrate the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." And so there, the Apostle Paul just simply says, Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed, and uses all the imagery of Passover to make an appeal to the Corinthians. And so this connection between Jesus' death and Passover was really crucial for the early Christians. And so it reminds us that we need to make sure we're at least somewhat familiar with the Passover story. And so you can read the Passover, the original Passover story, in Exodus chapter 12. It's when the death angel passed over the nation of Egypt and put to death all the firstborn male in Egypt, both of animals and of humans. And then that led to the Israelites fleeing Egypt, then Egypt in pursuit, then the Red Sea parting, and that whole story. Well, that's Passover. And when God redeemed Israel out of Egypt, with this Passover moment, he instituted a commemorative feast, the Passover feast, which was to remind them of the haste in which they left Egypt. And they didn't have time to even let their bread rise, hence unleavened bread. And then that becomes a symbol of faithfulness and purity and all that. And so God redeemed them from their slavery in Egypt, set them free, led them into the promised land. And that's Passover. And it was celebrated every year on the 15th of Nisan by the Jewish calendar, which is a little bit of March and a little bit of April by our modern calendar. And then the Passover feast, the Passover celebration, was then followed by the week-long feast of unleavened bread. And so it was this huge holiday in the Jewish calendar. And Jesus says to his disciples here that the Passover, meaning specifically the Passover feast. They're at the beginning stages of the festival. They've come into the city, and the Passover meal is just 2 days away. And then in that context of the Passover coming, Jesus going to be crucified, Matthew recounts how the chief priests there in Jerusalem want to do away with Jesus. Look at verse 3. At that time, the chief priests and the elders of the people were gathered together in the courtyard of the high priest named Caiaphas. And ironically, in just a couple days, they'll be back in this courtyard at night with Jesus in their custody. And it will be here that they decide that he must die for blasphemy. And it's also here in this courtyard where Peter is going to deny Jesus 3 times. This courtyard is going to be very central to the events that follow over the next couple of chapters. And notice it is the courtyard of the high priest named Caiaphas. Caiaphas was appointed as high priest in the year 18 AD by the Roman governor who preceded Pilate. And you need to note that at this time, the high priest was actually appointed by the Romans, which made it into a political office. So it wasn't purely just a high priesthood in a religious sense and a Jewish sense. It was also a high priesthood that had responsibilities to the Romans and their allegiance to the Romans and their loyalty to the Romans and their working with the Romans could ensure them power and status and wealth and all of that. And that's the situation. And it's that situation that's going to play out in the scenes that follow with Jesus' arrest and bringing him to Pilate and all of that. One other interesting note about Caiaphas is this, that archaeologists have actually found his ossuary. What's an ossuary? Well, it's a bone box. The Jews would put a dead person into a tomb, and then when all the flesh had rotted off, they would gather up the bones, put them in the box, a little stone bone box, and set that aside so that the ledge on which the body had been set could be used for the next person in the family to die. Well, archaeologists have actually found the bone box of Caiaphas, this high priest. I'll put a picture of it in the study hub. So there they are in the courtyard of the high priest, and verse 4, they plotted together to arrest Jesus covertly and kill him. That's their objective. They don't want to just arrest him. They want to kill him. They want to do away with him. But, verse 5, they were saying, not during the festival, otherwise a riot might occur among the people. They knew that Jesus had many people in the crowds that had gathered for Passover that were loyal to him. And they knew that a riot could ensue. This was always a great fear during Passover time. Thousands and thousands of pilgrims coming into the area for the festival. The Romans would actually bring in extra troops to try to keep the peace and quell the crowds and all of that. So this is a real live possibility. And so we're like, nah, not during the festival. We don't want a riot to ensue. That could be a real problem. So they're trying to figure out how they can do this. Now, Matthew cuts the story at that point and inserts another story into the middle of this, and then we'll wrap back to their plan and their plot after that other story. And so we cut here in verse 6 to a new scene. Look what it says. Now, when Jesus was in Bethany at the home of Simon the Leper. Bethany is where Jesus has friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. It's where Jesus has been staying during the festival and even leading up to the festival. He spent some time there. And he's at a dinner party here in this scene at a man whose name is Simon. And it seems as if Simon is presumably a former leper. Maybe he had been healed by Jesus. We don't know. But he's just known as Simon the Leper. And while Jesus is there, here's what happens. Verse 7. A woman came to him with an alabaster vial of very expensive perfume, and she poured it on his head as he was reclining at the table. Now, this is similar to another incident, very much like this, that occurs in Luke chapter 7, verse 36 and following. But there, the woman is a sinful woman, and she pours it at Jesus' feet, not on his head. Here, it's at his head. This same event is told in Mark chapter 14, and it's likely also the same event in John chapter 12, where we learn that the woman's name is Mary. maybe Mary, Jesus' friend who lives in Bethany, maybe another Mary. Mary was one of the most common names in first century Judaism. So the woman's name is Mary. And there in John 12, it actually seems to have occurred, if it's chronological, before the triumphal entry. But here in Matthew, as well as in Mark, it's inserted into this moment of the plot to do away with Jesus, and it's tied thematically to his death and resurrection. She comes with an alabaster vial of expensive perfume. And we've actually have some examples of these kinds of vials from that time period. They're anywhere from like 5 to 9 inches tall with a long neck. And it's full of this perfume that's very expensive. How expensive? Well, we're not told here in Matthew's account, but in Mark's account, Mark 14, verse 5, the disciples claim that that vial of perfume was worth around 300 denarii. In other words, about a year and a half's wages. This is a costly act of devotion by this woman towards Jesus. But look how the disciples respond, verse 8. But the disciples were indignant when they saw this. They were angry and upset, and they said, "Why this waste? For this perfume could have been sold for a high price and the money given to the poor." And so they're angry at her. They see this as an act of waste. They suggest that maybe the money could have been given to the poor. And it's not clear, particularly in the context here, that their motives are actually that noble, but that's what they're claiming at least. And they're upset with this woman. In fact, in Mark's account, it says they were scolding her. But Jesus comes to her defense. Look at verse 10. But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She's done a good deed for me. For you will always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." And that's sort of part of that thematic connection. He's just announced that he's going to be crucified in just a couple of days. And so here he's acknowledging, she's actually done a good deed to me. You're not always going to have me around. It's not that Jesus is minimizing helping the poor. He's saying you can help the poor at any time, but there's actually something bigger at play right now, something bigger going on with he himself. And then Jesus explains a little bit further in verse 12. He says, "For when she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare for my burial." He's still trying to drive home this point that he's about to be crucified. They need to get it. They need to understand he's not going to be around much longer, and they need to get this sorted. And so he says, it's like anointing me for my burial. Unlike the Egyptians who embalmed their bodies, right? And we've found plenty of Egyptian mummies. The Jews didn't do that. They anointed the body. So whether she was aware of it or not isn't really the point. Jesus sees her act as sort of like preparing his body for burial. And then he says this in verse 13, "Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told in memory of her." Notice Jesus envisions a worldwide proclamation of the gospel. And that's happened. And not only that, Jesus envisions that as that worldwide proclamation is told, the story of what this woman did will be told as well. And guess what? That's happened too. Her story has been told all throughout the world. Now, at that point, Matthew wraps back to the plot to do away with Jesus and writes this. Then, one of the 12, so we're wrapping back to this plot. They want to do away with Jesus. They want to find a way to do it covertly. They don't want to stir up a riot. Well, here's how that plays out. One of the 12, named Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What are you willing to give me to betray him to you?" Notice that he's really driven by his greed and his money. What will you give me? What gain can I get if I hand over Jesus? And so the rumors have circulated that are looking to do away with Jesus, and here comes a willing participant in their plot to do away with it. And they set out for him 30 pieces of silver, which calls to mind in some regards what's said in Zechariah chapter 11, verse 12. And from then on, he, that is Judas, looked for a good opportunity to betray Jesus. So now the stage is set. The high priests and the scribes on the human power side, they have an end to Jesus. They have this end to Jesus with one of the 12, one of his closest disciples, Judas, who now is a pawn in their very evil plan. And as I reflect on this little episode, notice that the snapshot of this woman's action of devotion to Jesus, her costly, self-sacrificial, expensive devotion to Jesus, is framed by the accounts of this plot to do away with Jesus and Judas's betrayal based on his self-serving and his greed. And the contrast couldn't be greater. The love and devotion, costly love and devotion of this woman, stands in stark contrast to their scheming, their efforts to destroy him, and Judas's self-serving motivations to participate in their plan to do away with him. And that self-serving, that scheming, that greed, money, right? It all kind of is marked down through this whole thing. And there appears to be a certain warning of the deceptive power of wealth, the deceptive power of money, and a call to engage in costly acts of love and devotion, just like this woman did, to sacrifice ourselves and to pour out our good things that we have on Jesus for his honor and for his glory. All right, thanks for tuning in to this session of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by the generosity of people just like you. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you want to join the team of supporters, best way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button, and it'll redirect you to a page, my page, through World Family Mission, registered nonprofit, where you can set up a one-time or a recurring monthly donation. Thanks in advance for your generous support.